is time to take longer strides. Time for a great new American enterprise. Time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth. I believe we possess all the resources and talents necessary. But the facts of the matter are that we have never made the national decisions or marshaled the national resources required for such leadership.
We are go for Apollo 11.
We have never specified long-range goals on an urgent time schedule.
T-minus 60 seconds and counting.
Or managed our resources and our time so as to ensure their fulfillment.
30 seconds and counting.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5.
No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. But in a very real sense, it will not be one man going to the moon. We make this judgment affirmatively. It will be an entire nation. I believe we should go to the moon.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Charles Garfield.
Thank you. Thank you. How many of you, by the end of this presentation, would like to be peak performers leading a stress-free life? Can you raise your hand? You know, I was sitting out in an audience when I first heard the question, and I raised my hand. I raised both hands. I thought I was going to get a little bit of magic, some silver bullet, some secret that would teach me how to make it all easy. And the secret I got was not the one I was counting on. The only stress-free people are dead people. There's no way you'd want a stress-free life. I'll tell you why, and then I'll tell you what the serious point is. And there is one. How many people here are sports fans? Can you raise your hand if you're a sports fan? Well, I am too, but let's take care of the people who are not. If you're not a sports fan, if you could care less about sports and fitness, if your feeling is like W.C. Fields, every time he felt an impulse to exercise, he'd lie down and wait for it to go away. That's okay. That's okay. Don't worry about it, because we'll only use sports as a metaphor, as a way of talking about peak performance. Now, can you imagine using this metaphor, going into the locker room before the Super Bowl, tapping a defensive tackle on the shoulder and saying, "Do you have any stress now?" That's crazy. He knows stress is built in. He knows he has to channel it into performance. How many people know the name Luciano Pavarotti? Great talent, extraordinary person. We interviewed him when he was in San Francisco. We've studied him for years. He's an interesting man, as friendly and as extroverted as he looks, great to party with, except before a performance, when he gets intense and determined and extremely stressed. And you wouldn't go up to Pavarotti before a performance and ask him about stress. He knows it's built in. Do you know that surgeons' pulse rates go up an average of 50 beats per minute? Surgeons' pulse rates go up an average of 50 beats per minute, above normal. If you ever have to have an operation, don't go to a stress-free surgeon. Makes no sense. So where do we get the idea that stress-free was good? I think we got it from the database journals that Americans read, from those research journals, those carefully thought-out research publications, like the National Enquirer and Reader's Digest and some of the others, and you know those research publications, those carefully thought-out publications. If you read them, you get an idea America's on this vendetta against stress, to stamp it out at all costs. And ladies and gentlemen, that is extremely naive. That is frightfully naive. You didn't build as fine a set of careers. You didn't build as fine a set of careers on naive notions of a stress-free workplace. You didn't build as fine a set of companies as are represented here on naive notions of stress-free work. And those of us who were involved in what is generally regarded as the human species' greatest technological achievement certainly didn't get there on naive notions of stress-free work. You saw it before. You know the situation I'm talking about. Apollo 11. Extraordinary situation. And when I think back over the 1,500 people we studied over a 20-year period, I can't help but think that in all of those situations, no one once talked about a desire for stress-free work. Let's think about it. Let's think about some of our most impressive people. People we've actually studied, written about, profiled. People like Lee Iacocca, Chrysler chairman, extraordinary hero in American folklore right now. Takes a company headed for disaster and turns it around and makes it work. How about Luciano Pavarotti? Great opera star, tremendous talent. Popularized his medium almost single-handedly. How about Mary Lou Retton? 16 years old, what pressure. Little kid, Olympic Games, turns in a marvelous performance. Gold medal winner, made a national celebrity. Talk about stress. We're talking about a group of people who understand, whether talking about stress management or time management, whether talking about strategic planning, whether talking about motivating yourself and others, whether talking about all the key ingredients of the high performers. We're talking about people who really understood the need for identifying those key elements that all of us can use. Every one of them starts in the same place. Mission. So that's what the secret was. That's what happened in that situation. And as you saw earlier, we got our mission from President John Kennedy. That was his mission statement to us. May 25th, 1961. His mandate to us, by the end of the decade, land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. Well, we did it. We made it barely, not by much. 1969. And then something very interesting happened. Something strange, something nobody could have predicted. Nobody's really written about it very much. All of those people, or nearly all, who did the best work of their lives, whose performance went way beyond anything they had done before, whose productivity peaked, went right back down to former levels. And below, in some cases, they couldn't sustain it. And the key to peak performance, whether you're training yourself or training the people who work with and for you, the purpose is not to get there once and reminisce for the rest of your life. The purpose is to be able to sustain it. Well, we couldn't. There were many of us who couldn't. I didn't know what was going on. It was years later before I finally really got a handle on it. And it was during a luncheon with somebody whose name you'd recognize, Dr. Linus Pauling, 2 Nobel Prizes. And I asked him, well, what do you do after you win a Nobel Prize? He said, it's easy, kid. You change fields, of course. But see, he didn't mean take the easy way out. He didn't mean switch organizations. He didn't mean switch careers. He meant find something else you can sink your teeth into. Don't just go through the motions. And I remembered back to the Apollo days. And I remembered exactly what he was talking about. After the moon landing, all of those folks who only a few months before were excited and fired up and wired by what we were doing in the most positive, motivated sense, were moping around, going through the motions. They had no idea what was going on, and I didn't either. I made a switch at that point, a career switch. I wanted to find out why so many human beings in that situation did the best work of their lives. I was trained as a mathematician, had to go back to school, go through a whole doctoral program in psychology to get as much information as I could about how human beings tick. And when I looked back on that Apollo situation, one thing stands out, the most important thing I'm going to say. Peak performers are made, not born. Period. Remember the old debate? I love it. I still love it. Are great leaders born or made? They're made. All of them. Are great performers born or made? They're made. All of them. And there are a lot of bright people out here. And one of you at least, maybe 6 or 7, are thinking, what about Mozart? What about Einstein? What about all of those people? You want to work like Mozart and Einstein? You want to transform yourself? Pablo Picasso did a work a day for 60 years. That's made. The point is not to become an Einstein. The point is not to become a Mozart or a Picasso. The point is to take your genetic endowment, whether it's the equal of theirs or not, and transform yourself to levels you've never even thought of. I've never even thought of. We're talking about the ability to take your inheritance and move it way beyond anything you've dreamed of. The history of the human species is littered with examples of very, very, very talented people who never actualized it, never developed it. Peak performers are made, not born. Now you might ask, how? How are they made? What do they look like? How do they even define peak performance? There's a question, and an interesting one. We asked the peak performers we interviewed, well, how do you define peak performance? They all said pretty much the same thing. They didn't talk much about money. They didn't talk much about status. They didn't talk much about rising to the top of their organizations. They talked almost nonstop about making major increases over anything they've done in the past. They talked about increases in performance. They talked about exciting kinds of projects. They talked about major moves toward higher levels of productivity. Now, you might ask, can you give me an example? Let's pick America's favorite right now, Mr. Iacocca. Again, everybody's looking at what he's done, and his book is doing so well, and he's become an American folk hero. Let's take a look at it, dispassionately, sort of. Why would a man that accomplished, president, Ford Motor Company, one of the most esteemed companies in the world, why would a man that accomplished get unceremoniously bounced out of his position? One day, president, next day, Siberia. Why would he leave that situation, dragging his golden parachute behind him? You know, when you're at that level and you leave, you get a lot of money to leave. So the story wasn't all that sad. So now he's leaving, hurt, but rich. And now he's sitting at home. He could have taught at a college, could have written a book. All sorts of people would have offered him all sorts of jobs. Why would a man that bright, within weeks, voluntarily take over the captaincy of the Titanic? Either very dumb or extremely smart. He pulls it through. He makes it happen. The Titanic doesn't sink. Chrysler Corporation makes it. The man becomes a folk hero for all time. Now his worth is in the mega millions of dollars. Now he's finished, right? He's in an age where he can teach at a university, be a sage, be an emeritus. What does he do? He starts talking about the only thing more difficult, running for political office. And you know he's serious because he denies it all the time. He's learning from them. He's a quick study. Now, what is it with this guy? Either very dumb or extremely smart. Peak performers are people committed to going way beyond anything they've done in the past. But how? That's the question. How do they do it? How can we all orchestrate the same kinds of excellence in our own careers? The key is not to be a Super Bowl athlete or a Pavarotti or a Katharine Hepburn or an Iacocca. The key is to be a much better version of yourself. Even those of us who have done well, many of us have done extremely well. I'm not talking about yanking people up from mediocrity. I'm talking about the excitement of what you've done that you're proud of. How can you leverage that to get higher levels? What's the action plan of the peak performer? First, number one, point. Motivated by mission. They are motivated by mission. The place to start is not goals. The place to start is not strategic planning. Those are important skills. The place to start is mission. Prove it to yourself. Go to any business library in America. Yank the annual reports of 10 or 20 of America's best-run companies. You choose. Look on page 1. You'll find a mission statement. You know who else knows that? America's most productive people. They start in the same place. Mission. And they're not all the superstars. If you were to ask me, what's the most interesting mission? The most powerful one you've ever heard? It would not be anybody you'd recognize. It's a guy who works in a toll booth on the Oakland Bay Bridge in California. In a toll booth. I'm talking about boring jobs. I don't want to be disrespectful for people who work in toll booths, but that's not high melodrama. There are 17 toll booths on that bridge. I live out there, and I know I've been through every one of them hundreds of times. I've never had a conversation with anybody. I hand over the money like everybody else, and I take off. One day, approaching one of those toll booths, I heard loud rock music. Sounded like a Michael Jackson concert. Looked in the toll booth. The guy was dancing. I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm having a party." I said, "What about the rest of these people?" He said, "They're not invited." I thought, this guy's amazing. 16 people going through the motions. One guy's having a party. Same job. I had a million questions. I thought I might have stumbled into a peak performer in a very unlikely place. Before I got a word out, I heard beeping, loud, aggressive beeping. Looked behind me. There was a workaholic behind me. You know, red in the face, hypertensive, beeping his horn. You know the type. If you don't give them what they want, they die and ruin your day. So I drove off, made a mental note, find the guy in the toll booth again. He'll teach you something. Weeks later, pulled up, same guy, still dancing, having a good time. I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm still dancing. I remember you from the last time." And I pointed down the row of toll booths before I could get a word out. He said, "You see where you're pointing? What does that look like to you?" I said, "It looks like a row of toll booths. What does it look like to you?" He said, "Vertical coffins." "Vertical coffins? What are you talking about?" He said, "I can prove it to you. Every morning, 8 o'clock, live people get in and die for 8 hours. At 4 o'clock, like Lazarus from the dead, they reemerge alive and go home. But while they're here, they're dead on the job, and those are vertical coffins." And I was amazed. He had a whole metaphor system, a system of images worked out for himself, and I couldn't help ask, why is it different for you? This man has exactly the same job as everybody else. No privilege. He said, "You want to know my secret?" I said, "Yep." He said, "Take me to lunch." So I said, "Okay, I'll take you to lunch. Where?" I don't know if you know the San Francisco Bay Area. In every town, there are famous restaurants. Without a second's worth of hesitation, he said, "Take me to Ernie's." Now, Ernie's is $100 a person for lunch. How does this man know it's even there? I had the idea I wasn't the first. Now we're at Ernie's. We're having lunch, and he's ordering up a storm. Little guy ate a lot. Dessert comes. I made the cardinal error. I suggested that were I to have his job, I might be bored. He hit the roof. He said, "You have no imagination." Bored. I have a corner office, glass on 3 sides. I work out of doors in a place that half of America vacations to. You're standing where I'm standing. You can see the Golden Gate Bridge, city of San Francisco, the Berkeley Hills. This is an amazing place. Besides, what do you do? I was ready to sign up. The guy was amazing. 16 people dead on the job. One guy is having a party in a vacation land. What ingredient is that? This is not a privileged situation. If you could bottle this for your people, you'd conquer the world. This man has no privilege. He has a situation that would bore you to tears in an hour or 2 or 3. Why? What is it that makes it work for him? I couldn't quite let go. At the end of that lunch, I asked him, "There's got to be something else. You haven't told me everything. Why are you so happy? What motivates you?" He said, "Oh, you want to know my real secret." I thought he was going to hit me up for dinner for sure. But he didn't. He was a decent guy, and he said, "My real secret, I'm going to be a dancer someday. And I'm going to make it, too. And next time you pass my boss, he's in that administration building to the left of those toll booths. You take a look at me, and I'll be dancing. And you take a look at him, and you'll see a guy who doesn't know it, but he's paying for my training. He's going to be a dancer someday. Mission. He's training himself in that toll booth. Whether he ever makes it or not is almost irrelevant. He believes he's going to do it. And he's there, a man with a mission, in a situation that would bore you and I to tears quickly. Motivated by mission. Next, the ability to innovate and change. What did Iacocca see that everybody else didn't see at Chrysler? Remember that time? Remember that time and place? All of the predictions going down the tubes, never going to make it, nobody can make it happen, impossible. What was he looking at? Why was he able to see it differently? What about the man in the toll booth? Why was he able to see it differently? 16 people condemned for the rest of their natural lives to going like this. One guy is having a party in a vacation land. That's a big difference. What is it? What is it that they see that other people don't? Let's take a look. I'd like you to tell me one thing that you see. Just one. Tell me one thing that you see. What do you see? Okay, I have a vote for lady. Old, young? I have a vote for a young lady. How many people see the young lady? Can you raise your hand? Okay, you're safe. They see it too. It must be there. Okay, we have one category called young lady. What else do you see? Okay, old witch, old lady. Let's give her the benefit of the doubt. We don't know what she does for a living, but let's call her an old lady. How many people see an old lady? Okay, you're safe. It must be up there. How many people do not see the young lady or the old lady? It's a sign of superior intelligence to not see one. There's the peak performer, right? I don't know what he's talking about, but I'll take it. Everybody see them both? Let me point them out. Young lady's got a feather in her hair, hairdo, eyelash, nose. This is the ear of the young lady right here. But it's also the eye of the old lady. If you can see this, you can pretty much move back and forth. Old lady, nose, nostril, mouth. Again, eye. It's a profile. How many people have children, grandchildren, little friends over the age of 2 but under the age of 12? Between 2 and 12. I have awesome respect for you. I was in a first grade class showing them this, testing something. 6-year-olds running around, making noise, doing all sorts of stuff, pretty much what we used to do, I suspect. And I didn't know what to do. They weren't nearly as polite as you. So in self-defense, I yelled out, "How many people see the raccoon?" I was fooling around. All the hands went up. I was petrified. I asked the little cherub in the front row, "Where's the raccoon?" She said, "We all see it, doctor." She's going to own her own company by the time she's 12. And then she proceeded to point it out. Look at this dark figure down here. Under the nose of the old lady, under the chin of the young lady, there is a dark figure that looks suspiciously like a raccoon. How did they see it? How did they see it? I did what adults do. I pulled rank. I said, "What the hell you know? You're only 6. It's not a raccoon, it's a porcupine." You could show this to hundreds of groups of adults. You'd get a couple of people who'd see the raccoon, maybe a poet and a schizophrenic. Why did the little ones see it? Because children have high tolerance for innovation, high tolerance for change. Like the man in the toll booth, like Lee Iacocca, like some of the most extraordinary stories we've ever heard from people in visible situations, from people in management and sales and marketing and technical areas, in corporate situations, in company situations of all kinds. The ability to take the same data, we didn't switch the picture, the same data, and find an old woman, a young woman, a raccoon, and God knows what else. It's called tolerance for innovation. It's the ability to move back and forth, the ability to find options when everybody else is seeing the same old stuff. When everybody else is saying, "Oh, God, you should see where I work. It's a jungle back there." It's a jungle. I got people working in my place who haven't even reached mediocrity yet. And I report to them. And one person in the corner of the room, one man or woman, is saying, "There's got to be another way to do this. Let's take a look at it another way." And they will see the old woman and the young woman. They'll see the raccoon, and they may see some other things too. I'm sure that some of you have worked in situations, probably for bosses who had very, very low tolerance for innovation. Very low. Very low. If you showed them this, if you showed them that diagram, that graphic, and asked, "What do you see up there, boss?" He'd say, "See an old woman." And you're bright and creative, and you'd look and say, "Couldn't there also be a young woman up there?" He'd look again. "No. When you've been around here as long as I have, you know that's an old woman, period. And when he goes to the hospital for an operation, he has cataracts put in." You know who I mean. He'd never come to this. He'd never be here. He knows everything. Mind not like a steel trap, but like a Tupperware container. You burp it every couple of weeks, close it up. Nothing ever gets in. Nothing new ever happens. That attitude, ladies and gentlemen, is a disaster. In the world changing as rapidly as ours, where technological innovation abounds, where tolerance for innovation is a necessity, the "we always have done it this way" attitude, whether or not it ever worked, certainly doesn't work now. The people who will thrive in the years ahead are the people whose tolerance for change and innovation, the ability to take the old data and find new solutions, those folks will thrive while the others won't. Motivated by mission, ability to innovate and change, empowering others through teamwork. These are team players. These are team builders. These are people who know how to collaborate well. They can be self-reliant. They can work on their own, but they work well with groups of people. They understand that working in groups as well as working alone, critical. You might say, "Well, looks like I've got to change a few things here." Perhaps. But change is critical. I have a friend who studies change for a living. He says one of the things we have to learn, even those of us, I was trained as a mathematician and worked alone, the luxury is no longer there. Change in the direction of collaboration, teamwork, interdependence. This friend of mine who studies it for a living, an interesting man. He's a duck hunter by avocation. He trains these hunting dogs. His dogs do things that nobody would believe. Talk about challenging your belief system. And he took along a gentleman we both know whose ability to change is microscopic. 2 guys and a dog are out in the boat. My friend shot a duck. The dog, his amazing trained animal, leaped out of the boat, sprinted across the top of the water. Peak performer dog. Gets the duck, brings it back. Other guy says nothing. No data, no information, nothing. He figured maybe he shocked him. There is such a thing. So he shot another duck. Dog did the same thing. Extraordinary performance across the top of the water. Retrieved the duck, brought it back. Other men, no response at all. He figured, well, one more try. Maybe it's a hopeless case. He tried again. Dog did the same thing. An Olympian performance across the top of the water. Retrieved the duck, brought it back. The other gentleman said not a word. My friend couldn't stand it. Grabbed him and shook him and said, don't you see anything unusual about my dog? The guy said, yeah, the little sucker can't swim. You know anybody like that? They wonder why they don't get invited to your house for parties. Nothing gets in. Learning innovation and change. Learning about teamwork and interdependence. Not lip service. Not lip service. Not somebody getting up and saying, we're one big happy family. And hearing 2/3 of the audience say, yeah, like hell we are. I mean real interdependence. Now, if you wanted to ask the question, what makes for a team? What allows those people who collaborate best to do it? In a word, feedback. In both directions. The ability to give it well and insisting on receiving it from key people. Feedback. For feedback to work, it's got to be accurate. So if you're giving it, you've got to be correct. It's got to be useful. You've got to be able to apply it. Or the person you're giving it to has to be able to apply it. And non-judgmental. Non-judgmental. You're commenting on the behaviors, not the person's worth. Now, there are ways to kill a team. You can ruin the way you give feedback. You can destroy team camaraderie. There are two ways that I can guarantee will kill any team. Families, little teams, business teams, sports teams. The best way I know of, set up a rule that works like this. The mature person doesn't need feedback, doesn't need it, doesn't need positive feedback of any kind. That's why we pay you. We pay you to do well. We don't have to baby you and comment all the time. However, if you make an error, a memo documenting it will go to all levels of management. Notice how his enthusiasm rises as he says this. We will post those memos on the wall. We'll send your mother a copy. We'll drop them from a blimp over your neighborhood. Every error documented. All the good stuff, 10, 20 years of hard work, extra effort, weekends, nights. Hey, that's why we pay you. We don't have to comment. Ladies and gentlemen, that is an absolute disaster in our age. Go to any library, anyone you want. Go to the business section. Pull out a book on human resource development, human productivity. Take a look at motivational areas. Take a look in the index and you'll see positive reinforcement listed. Look it up. You'll see that positive reinforcement, positive feedback, the single most powerful external motivator of human beings toward high performance. Henry Ford knew it. The captains of industry knew it. Henry Ford used to walk around this plant and catch people doing something right. Not wrong, but right. He would catch them doing something right. If they did something extraordinary, he'd write out a check and hand it to them on the spot. Ask yourself, you're in his plant. What do you want to get done? You want to get caught doing something right. Not wrong. Not brilliant, but important. Want to kill a team? I got another way. Reward only the leader for a team effort. Reward only the leader. So the leader's up here getting a check from the president of the company or a promotion or a raise from the CEO of the company and really feeling great, and the troops are in the front row planning his or her assassination. Of course, they know damn well who did all the work. And as soon as that meeting's over, they go to the local pub to talk it over. And you know what they're talking about when he or she is not around? I don't believe it. He took all the credit. She didn't mention us once. We've been working on this for years. They don't even know we're here. They think she did it or he did it. They have no idea we're even here. And on the very next Monday morning, when that happy family gets together, that leadership position is gone. There is no longer a team. There is now a crowd. And as a much different group to motivate. You know who taught us that? O.J. Simpson. Great football player, extraordinary talent. If you remember back a few years, he played professional football, and he'd win games for his team. He'd score touchdowns. He'd be on coast-to-coast television after the game, and somebody'd be interviewing him and telling him how great he was. And he'd look horrified. He'd shut the guy up in a minute. He'd say, hey, wait, this is a team game. I didn't do this alone. And he'd mention his offensive line, those big guys who block for him. He'd mention them by name because they never get any credit. O.J. Simpson was a very smart leader, a very smart manager. O.J. knew that if he didn't mention them by name on the very next Sunday, it's nice that you follow that image. On the very next Sunday, one of those very large fellows who blocks for him would tie his shoe at the wrong time. And an equally large, extremely motivated, somewhat angry young man on the other team would try to rearrange O.J.'s career that weekend. Smart manager. You know that happens in business? That happens in families? Happens in jobs? No, we don't tackle people in the hallway. We do it in more painful ways. The team will slowly wind down and not really put out a whole lot and not really reach quota and not really. And you know what? When a team does poorly, they don't fire the team. They fire the coach. The leader's the one who's in trouble at that point. Empowering others through teamwork. Next, oriented around results. Let's take a look at those people who are most results-oriented, because this is the fourth characteristic, oriented around results. The peak performers are extremely results-oriented people. What do? How do they think about results? Same way you do. Goals. They talk about goals. They talk about quotas. They talk about targets. They talk about objectives. But they do one thing that was dramatically different than we found in everybody else. They make sure that those goals are linked to an overriding mission. You can be very goal-directed and not have any idea why. I had a person in my organization in a research position, very hard driver, goal-directed person, would always launch in a bunch of different directions, accomplish a great deal, half of which had nothing to do with what the organization was about. Had nothing to do with what our mission was about. And I had no idea why this person, as talented as he was, kept getting in people's way. One day, a number of us went out to a concert. About 7 or 8 of us went from the organization, from the company. We went after work, had dinner, went to a concert. We went to see an ambidextrous musician. A guy was playing an instrument with either hand, direct eye contact with the audience. He was an amazingly talented man. And this friend of mine, this overzealous friend of mine, blurted out right in the middle of the concert, "God, I'd give my right arm to be ambidextrous." Oh, yeah? Better cut into your productivity a little. Launches quickly, very goal-directed. You got to give it to him. Very goal-directed. Doesn't think through consequences. Gets himself and us into a lot of trouble. Big difference between mission and goals. Mission is the overriding purpose. Goals, the measurable, quantifiable steps to getting there. The peak performers talked about 3 kinds of goals. Short term. What are you going to accomplish in the next 2 to 3 months that help you reach your mission? Intermediate, a year. Long term, 2 to 3 years. In some cases, more. But they talked about short term, intermediate, long-term goals. Now, you might ask the question, what can I do as an individual here? We've got some individual skills that we can apply and learn. What can I do? That's the 5th point. Developing yourself as a resource. We are now in the age of information. Call it the computer age, call it the age of automation, call it whatever you like. What we're talking about is a fundamentally different set of realities, controlling principles, if you will. If the first era that we went through as a nation was the era of agriculture, and if the second was the industrial era, the third, the age of information, has not land and not machinery, but people as its controlling reality. This is not a metaphor. In some of the most impressive studies coming out, including Office of Economic Research, Office of Economic Research, New York Stock Exchange, 30 to 40% of productivity increase in corporate organizations will come not from technological innovation, not from investment strategies that are astute, but from the effective use of human beings, people, the effective use of human capital. Now, how do I develop myself as a resource? How do I develop myself? Step number 1, lifelong learning. Do you know it all? If you do, why are you here? If you don't, then there must be something to learn. That attitude is critical. Obviously, we're all in a position where we can learn something. In many cases, a lot. Now, let's take a look at what we're talking about bottom line. We've all heard in the last few years a great deal about excellent companies, heard a lot about peak-performing organizations, and a lot of it has been very interesting and helpful. But the bottom line, peak-performing organizations, excellent companies don't guarantee excellent employees any more than excellent schools guarantee excellent pupils. There are advantages. Having sensitive, aware, current organizations, critical. But it is not the whole story. Developing individuals, developing people. It takes peak-performing individuals to make peak-performing organizations. Now, How do I develop myself? I want to develop myself. I'd like to. I'll make the investment in myself. I sometimes hear from people, I'll make the investment in myself. I'll try my best. And I love hearing that because that's the starting place. I hear so often, as you do, the reverse. Doc, I'm already 26. I'm over the hill. It's almost retirement. Maybe for my kid, I got a little girl. She's 3. Maybe I can use this for her. But for me, it's too late. Some of the most impressive data we've collected, by the way, are people past the age of 65 who are moving for the very first time toward high performance. Age turned out not to be a variable. Sex turned out not to be a variable. Want to hear a major variable? Personal motivation. Belief that you can do it. Major variable. Last year, American industry spent $10 billion on training, improving people. $10 billion. A lot of it excellent training. But you know what? Real change almost never starts there. Training, critical, but it almost never starts with training. You can tell people to change their behaviors. You can train them as best you can. You can try to continually motivate them. But until we make the internal decision to excel, nothing much will happen. It starts with your choice and mine. Your choice and mine. That's where it starts. And if the little voice in your head is going, oh, God, you don't know where I work, Doc. There's no way. There's no way. They're just Neanderthals. There's no way. Why do you stay there as bright as you are? I have to, Doc. Kids, 2 kids, 4, 6 kids, all going to college. Houses. Got to fund my boat. Somebody's got to fund my boat. Might as well be me. Just tell me you made the choice to stay where you are and you're going to live by it. Fine, no problem. But let's not assume that this isn't for you. The talent in this room, the talent in general among functional, creative, aware people is extraordinary. And I don't mean the exceptions. I mean all of us. Now, let's take a look. How far can you go? How far can you go as an individual? Let's take a look at the hard-nosed facts. How many people remember Roger Bannister's breaking of the 4-minute mile? Remember that? So much press coverage. All he did was run around 4 times. A lot of press coverage. He was interviewed. If you ever wondered what happened to Roger Bannister, he went to medical school, became a very well-known neurologist. He's in Great Britain, doing very well as a doctor. He was just appointed head of the Medical Society at Cambridge, where he graduated. A long time ago. We must be getting old. Roger Bannister breaks the 4-minute mile. Everybody makes a tremendous fuss. He said in the interview, there's a much bigger story. Why doesn't anybody ever pay attention to the much bigger story? Interviewer asks, what is it? He said, do you know that there were several papers published before my run? Several papers published about how the mile could not be run in under 4 minutes. Couldn't be done. Impossible. Research papers, not just crack papers. Research papers about how the mile couldn't be done in under 4 minutes. He read them. He's young. Maybe he believed it. He then thinks about the great milers in history, his idols, who had tried for years, couldn't do it. The great milers couldn't do it. The researchers were publishing papers about how it was physiologically impossible. What does it take for that person to engage that mission anyway? To say to himself, I think I can do it. I don't care what they're writing. And I don't care who hasn't done it before. I think I can make this happen. One day, Bannister goes out, runs the mile in under 4 minutes. Everybody makes a big fuss and misses a much more significant reality. Try this. In the 10 years following that run, 50 other people ran the mile in under 4 minutes. It was done 50 other times after that run. That was no impossibility at all. It was a mental, attitudinal block. It had nothing to do with what was real. It had to do with what we believed was real. Within 10 years, Jim Ryan, 17-year-old high school student from Kansas, ran the mile in under 4 minutes. Kids were doing it within 10 years. There was nothing impenetrable about that obstacle except our belief. How many people, and I'll give one esoteric sports story. How many people remember Bob Beeman's long jump, 1968 Olympic Games? Many hands didn't go up. We'll start from scratch. The long jump is an event. Let's start from basics. It's an event in which a tall, slender person runs down a cinder track and jumps into a bunch of sand for a living. Then a bunch of old guys get real excited. They run out and they measure it for a living. They're fantastic athletes. Am I wrong or what? That's what it is. They're fantastic athletes. And try to put this into context. If you break the world record by 1 inch particularly at the Olympic Games. They'll put your picture on the cover of Sports Illustrated. They will throw parties for you. An inch farther than anybody has in history, you are a star. 1 inch is a star. One day, 1968, Mexico City, Bob Beamon broke the world long jump record by almost 2 feet. What do you say to the guy? Nice going? I mean, anybody with any sense said, what the hell was that? And Beamon, who's a very bright man, said, I don't know and I'm retiring. What's he going to say? My coach and I planned this? They had no idea what happened. No idea. And here's the challenge for you and me. You and I are capable of more than Bannister and more than Beamon. Now, you can't just drop that insight, if it is one, on a group of intelligent adults and head for the door. You've got to prove it. You and I are capable of more than Bannister or Beamon. I'll prove it to you. How many people here have ever read an article, magazine article, newspaper article, that sounded like this? Same general theme. 63-year-old grandmother lifts the back end of a car to save her grandchild. How many people have read a story sounded like that? I collect them. I see them all the time. I find them absolutely amazing. And if you can document that it actually happened with credible witnesses, with people who actually saw it, who are credible, those are very interesting people to study. Last one, 63-year-old grandmother, Tallahassee, Florida. Laura Schultz. Had breakfast with her. She didn't want to talk about what happened. She didn't want to talk about what happened on that day. When she lifted the back end of a car, her little grandson scampered free. She didn't want to talk about it. Wanted me to call her Granny, so I kept calling her Granny, and I ate breakfast with her, and she was wonderful. Treated me well, must have been a great grandmother. Finally, I just had to ask her the question, Granny, what's the heaviest thing you think you can lift? She said, this bottle of Pepto-Bismol. I'd call her an underachiever. 5 Thursdays ago, she lifted a Buick, which weighs a hell of a lot more than a bottle of Pepto-Bismol. If she was a peak performer, she would have looked at me and said, I can lift a Buick, kid. What can you lift? She was so petrified of what? Her own talent, her own possibilities, her own potential. She was so petrified, she erased it. She didn't want to think about it. Didn't want to know about it. You know why? Not because I was going to ask her to sign up for a career lifting Mack trucks and Greyhound buses. Because I was going to ask her the question, if you can do this, I wonder what else you don't know about you're capable of. I wonder what other kinds of things you might do. That's what she was afraid of. She was afraid of looking at her own potential. She was afraid that this researcher smart guy, or one of her kids, or one of her friends, might have said, you know, there might be other areas that you're really capable in, that you could have done extraordinarily or still could do extraordinarily well in. Didn't want to hear it. Did not want to hear it. Why are we so afraid of our own potential? For 6 years, ladies and gentlemen, I was on the faculty at the Cancer Research Institute, University of California Medical Center, San Francisco, the most heavily funded cancer research institute in the world. I was there for one reason, study a group of people who nobody ever studies, at least in this light. People who had terminal prognoses, who were supposed to die but didn't. They survived, back to work, back to life, healthy, 5 years, 8 years, no sign of disease. They were supposed to die, but they survived. And I had a hypothesis, a premise, that these folks were indeed peak performers. That they were going to, if we studied them, appear like the astronauts, like the high performers on the Apollo mission, like the great athletes, like the great business high performers we studied, as another group with the same characteristics. If you work in a medical center, one of the first things you have to do is you talk to the physicians of all of these people. And I asked the docs, well, what happened? They said, oh, those are our spontaneous remissions. Takes about 20 minutes to figure out that's a medical euphemism for damned if we know what happened. So I went to the only group of people I could study who might be able to teach me something, the patients themselves. And I asked them, well, what do you think happened? And it was obviously very dramatic. What do you think happened? And you know what they said? They kept saying the same thing. I drew on resources I never knew I had. I was way tougher, way stronger, way more resilient than I ever knew. And they kept talking about what sounded like talents. They kept talking about what sounded like capabilities of theirs that they never even knew were there. I started hearing somebody describe themselves in ways that suggested there were parts of their own potential, critical parts, that were untapped. And I kept thinking, well, how did you access them? What did you actually do? You must have contributed something. I know you didn't lie there and wait for injections. What did you do? And once in a while, when I had a particularly good rapport with somebody, they would tell me a story. And after having heard the story on more than a dozen occasions, I started really paying attention. The gist of the story was this. People would say, when it's late at night and nobody else is around, I ask myself the question, if I had 1 hour to live, what memories would pop up? What would be so important, so critical to me, that with 1 hour to live, it would surface as a memory? And you know, folks, there were only two categories they ever talked about. They talked about people they loved and who loved them, and who they wished they had more time with. And second, they talked about work they were proud of, work that made a difference, work that they invested in and gave their best shot to. Those were the only two categories. Not once did anybody in that exercise, in that situation, ever look at me and say, in the last hour of my life, my favorite memory was my Maserati. Nobody ever mentioned a possession of any kind. They mentioned work they were proud of and people they loved. And I started thinking, in that situation, were I to be in it, what would pop up? What work mattered to me so much that with 1 hour to live, I'd remember it? You know, you've already seen it. In my case, if I were to share it with you, what that would be, I know at least one thing I was involved in that I'm sure will appear. It was that very event you saw to start this talk.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
One small step for a man is what Neil Armstrong had written out. The first words on the moon are a misread. One small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind, and in a very critical way, Neil Armstrong took that leap for all of us. What he said in that one step, symbolically, was that all of us are capable of way more than we ever dreamed of. Way more. I'm talking about people who have done well are capable of way more. Now, you might ask, well, what can you leave me with? What's the most amazing person you've ever studied so that I have some images I can be left with that I can really carry on and share with the people who I care about at work, at home, and elsewhere? It wouldn't be a star. It wouldn't be an Iacocca story or a Super Bowl story or even an Apollo 11 story. It would be the story of Henry Peterson. You've probably never heard of Henry Peterson. And the story, although some people say it's apocryphal, I know it's not. Henry Peterson was a high school football star in Virginia decades ago. It's an interesting story about a young boy who was a very fine athlete. And like many people in that situation, good student also, he wanted to go to college. And he wanted to play college football for a coach he really respected. Henry wanted to go to Georgetown. Years ago, Georgetown used to play football. He wanted to play for Lou Little, a coach named Lou Little, who later went on to fame at Columbia University. Henry got into Georgetown, good student, tried out for the football team. He's not a star now. He's surrounded by high school stars, and he just barely made the team. And for 4 years, Henry sat on Lou Little's bench. Didn't play much, sat on that bench, and Lou Little described him in an interesting way. He said, Henry's a special guy. He doesn't play much. His talent level is not up to some of our other folks, but he's the glue that holds this team together. I love that phrase, the glue that holds it together. And I'd ask him, well, what glue? He said, the spirit of it all. The spirit of it all. In every system, family system, sports teams, company teams, there are people whose function it is not to be brilliant, not the Einsteins, but the collaborators. I mean that in the best sense of the word. The people who keep the team going and motivated. That's what Henry's role was. And for 4 years, although he didn't play much, he was the glue that held Lou Little's team together. In Henry Peterson's senior year, 1 week before the biggest game of the year, Georgetown and Fordham, Henry's father died. Conflict situation. He knows he has to go home. Henry had to go home to see his mother and brothers and sisters, but he was abandoning the team. Lou Little had no misgivings. He knew where Henry should be. He said, you go home, kid. You've got to be with your family. But, Coach, what about the team? He said, you go home. On game day, we'll say a prayer for you. Midweek, Lou Little calls, how you doing, son? It's awful, Coach. This is the worst thing that ever happened to me. I don't know what to do. You stay where you are, son, and you take care of your mother and brothers and sisters. And Henry did. He buried his daddy and took care of his family. And game day arrives. It's 12 o'clock. It's an hour before kickoff. Coach has a million things to do. Who walks into the locker room in full dress uniform? Henry Peterson. Lou Little hit the roof. What are you doing here, kid? I thought I told you to stay home. I couldn't, Coach. I had to come. And, Coach, can you do me a favor? Anything, Henry. Anything you want. Coach, I want to start today. Well, not anything, Henry. I mean, this game's bigger than you and me. You've been sitting on my bench for 4 years. I can't put you in. A lot's riding on this game. Please, Coach, just this once. Okay, on one condition. You can start on one condition, Henry. The first time you make an error of any sort that compromises this team effort, you're coming out. You understand? Okay, it's a deal, Coach. I understand. Henry Peterson started that Georgetown-Fordham game, proceeded to rush for 171 yards and 3 touchdowns. And if you know football, you know that that's as close to coming into a situation that's as close to single-handedly winning a game as anybody ever comes. Henry was not off the field more than 5 minutes after that game when Lou Little came rushing up to him, half furious and half amazed. Why didn't you tell me you could play like that? You've been sitting on my bench for 4 years. Coach, did you ever meet my daddy? I never had the pleasure, son. Did you ever see us in the springtime? We'd be walking on campus arm in arm, and I'd be pointing things out and talking to him. I did. I saw that a couple of times, but what's your point, son? Coach, my daddy was blind. And today was the first game he could ever see me play. If Henry Peterson was here, and if he joined me in talking to you, he would tell you that it was that moment, a moment that he calls my sweet spot in time, a moment that he knew that his potential was far greater than anything he had considered before, that his potential to be a peak performer, using our terms, way greater than anything he had considered. Henry Peterson went on to a career in sales that was second to none, founded his own company, took it to the head of its industry. And if he were here today, he would look at you and join me in saying one thing. The potential for that level exists in every one of us. Thank you very much. Thank you.